Who had grandparents fight in WW2 and what stories did they share? Grandfather was in an amphibious division in the Pacific Theater. He left us with little snippets of his time. A camp was pitch black because they didn't want to be visible from above. A guy in his cabin went to the outhouse and sat down to do his business when he heard something. He pulled his lighter out and lit it. A python was dangling down staring him in the face. He and another man were walking on a beach and the other guy just got shot through the head from a sniper. That sniper's decision led to my existence. General MacArthur showed up and gave him a promotion along with a few others. They took a video of MacArthur shaking the hands of a line of soldiers and used it for a pro-American propaganda film to be played before movies in the US. My grandma saw it and freaked TF out and the theater owners gave her a copy of the photo. I think Grandpa saw some shit because he never talked about it. And we later found out that he was lying when he said he never saw action. Both my grandfathers served in the US Army Air Force. One was a waist gunner on a B-17. He caught some shrapnel from a German A-Gun-1 mission and almost bled out on the return trip. While he was in the hospital his plane was shot down. The other was an MP who would tell us about busting heads in bars. My Austrian grandfather was drafted into the Wehrmacht and his unit was integrated into the SS in 1944. He was wounded in January 45 in the Battle of the Bulge whilst carrying out an attack on a US position. He got patched up by the Americans whilst the German officer wrote a letter home that he was missing in action. He still has the original letter. He was a prisoner of war in France from then on and had to stay until 46 or 47 as he was captured as a member of the SS and they were held longer than regular Wehrmacht soldiers. He still holds a grudge against the Nazis for stealing his youth and still has some shell or bullet fragments in his chest as far as I know. Cheers to the Americans for saving him. My grandpa on my dad's side was 17 at the time and lied about his age to get into the Navy. He played saxophone in the Navy band aboard ships in the Pacific. I don't think he ever saw action. Though. Aside from that 6-sax action of course. My grandpa was in the Army. He never spoke about his service but he was shot in the ankle and captured. He spent years in a VA hospital once he returned to the States. I heard second-hand stories about the POW camp. Specifically how the guards would smoke cigarettes and then intentionally flick the butts just out of reach of the prisoners inside the fence. He and his buddies devised a tool to reach out through the fence and grab the butts when the guard turned their back. They'd then pass the butt between them to get a tiny puff. He was a very kind, very quiet, very intelligent man who had a very bad drinking problem. Edited, thanks for all the responses and awards. When my grandmother died, we helped my grandfather move out of his house into an apartment. I had found a mason jar filled with old shiny rocks in his basement. When we looked closer, we realized it was gold teeth, aka kills from the war. That's when I learned my grandfather was a sniper. He served on the Pacific side fighting the Japanese. He died a couple of years ago at the age of 99. Well into his 90s though, he could still shoot a squirrel, with a gun and a slingshot, from a pretty long distance. He met up with the men in his unit every year after the war, until they all died. My granddad was in WW2 in a tank destroyer unit. He never talked about it but when I got back from a trip to Paris in high school he asked if it was still all blowed up over there. And said the last time he was there it was a big old mess. My grandfather enlisted when he was 14. Served in India for some years. But got shot by a sniper and was shipped back to UK. My grandfather was in World War II and then was called up for Korea. He told my mom that he was in special forces and that his primary weapon was the garrote. He refused to tell her any stories. And he committed suicide. My grandpa was in the Navy and was a rear gunner on a plane. He was still training when the war was finishing up, but the story goes that he was trying to shoot a target on the ground for training. He was adamant on hitting it so he unbuckled himself to get a better shot. Because of this he got pulled out of the plane and was hanging on only by the rear gun. Eventually he was able to pull himself back into the plane surprisingly. He probably never tried that again. In short, my grandpa was made prisoner. Was sent to Germany for work. Volunteered to work in a farm. He knew nothing about farming but though food would be easier to come by, he didn't know German either. Became friends with a little girl there. That was a bit older than his own kids. She started viewing him like an older brother. He attended her wedding once the war was over. She had a baby boy, he had a third. Unplanned child too. Those became friends. Attended each other's weddings. Then they had kids. Me and one of the German kids decided to learn each other's language. Then we studied in each other's country for a year, thanks. Erasmus program. I attended her wedding last year. We don't talk much anymore. I'm sorry to report. We're not that good at keeping in touch from afar. But rest assured we're trying. Not my true grandparents but my grandma's oldest brother. He fought in the Pacific through hell and back. He went by Pearl Harbor the day after and the Arizona was still on fire. One island he landed on had so much opposition that he had to use the guys in front of him bodies as meat shields. One funny story was that everyone at the base knew he didn't drink or smoke since his father was a raging alcoholic. So his bunkmates hid their booze under his bunk whenever the officers would come by and inspect camp. I unfortunately never met him, but hearing about his stories really fueled my interest in stories from throughout modern wars. From WW2 to Iraq. Edit, damn, this blew up overnight. My grandfather was in the resistance in Holland. He never spoke about the war to his wife, children or grandchildren. If asked to relate stories he'd reply, "I will not be responsible for the nightmares of another." Would turn his hearing aid off and nap in his chair. Grandfather was a U.S. sniper in the Pacific. One of the best stories was of a cocky officer who showed up and lined all the infantry up on the beach to tell them they were a bunch of pansies and he was going to whip them into shape. These men had been seeing hand-to-hand combat for months. The officer finally said, "If there's a man on this beach that thinks he can whip my ass, take one step forward." Every man took a step forward immediately. The officer didn't say much after that. Grandfather on my mom's side. He was in Europe somewhere guarding munitions that were stored in a rail car. He went into the munitions rail car and sat down to have a smoke. Gotta love the 40s. About 5 minutes later a German soldier hops into the rail car, locks eyes with my grandpa, and they both proceed to shit their pants and freeze. A few moments pass and my grandpa offers him a cigarette. They sit there smoking a while before the German motions to the door and my grandpa nods. German vacates the area and grandpa continues with his duties. This story was told to me as a child by my grandfather, who spoke more Italian than English. Some details are a bit fuzzy here or there, but it's my favorite and one I remember fondly. My grandfather, like a lot of Italians, was conscripted by the Browncoats to fight for Mussolini in the Italian army. He was sent to fight in the African campaign. Toward the beginning of the campaign he was struck by lightning and pronounced dead while on a long march during the monsoon season. At the time they were on march to a port or city. The story was a bit hazy here, alongside a column of tanks and artillery. When he was struck he was not examined immediately. Just presumed dead and thrown onto a truck carrying casualties. It wasn't until about a day later, when they reached their destination, that he was properly inspected. He had been laid out with other dead when one of the men assigned to prepare the dead for burial noticed him twitching. A doctor was called over and he was found to be alive and sent to be evacuated and treated along with other wounded. Before he could be evacuated, someone high in the command changed his orders. Thinking he was a good luck charm, they ordered him to stay with the honor guard for the rest of the war. In reality it ended up being his own good luck charm, as he avoided seeing major combat the rest of the war. When we were kids he used to get a kick out of showing the wound to us. When the lightning struck him it hit him in the head and exited from his calf, leaving a hole in his leg. The skin had grown over it so you wouldn't know anything was off except maybe a scar. But where the lightning bolt exited he could put a finger in his leg down to the knuckle. We all used to ask him to show us and we'd react like it was the grossest and coolest thing every time. I loved him. He was a great man, who after the war made his way to America to ensure we had every opportunity in life. TLDR, my grandfather was struck by lightning in the war and thought dead, only for them to realize he was alive days later. He rode out the rest of the war as a good luck charm for the command and made it home to his family to later bring them to America. My grandma was in the Merchant Marines and stationed on Lake Michigan. She was in charge of a Navy shipping yard. She said the hardest part was getting the men to look up from her chest. Then she got a master's degree in occupational therapy and worked for the Veterans Affairs. My one grandfather refused to ever talk about the war with anyone. Both of mine actually served in World War II, but one never heard any stories. My uncle was tasked with pulling bodies out of the ocean after D-Day. He was supposed to be in the invasion, but his officer reassigned him due to his age. He then became personal details for Eisenhower due to more people looking out for him. My grandfather was a train medic, not front line but where they took immediate survivors. The Germans were known to sabotage train bridges, and it was standard protocol to stop and inspect them before crossing. Well, his conductor was drunk and not only didn't stop but was speeding into the bridge when it exploded. My aunt has the pictures, but let's just say the rubble he was found under, wooden trains don't just derail, they shatter, especially off a bridge, was crazy. He described it to me and I wanted to cry. He lost many friends. Thanks for watching.